Hello and welcome to another episode of 1000 Actually Fun Books, where we are going through and reviewing books, looking for the best of fun escapist books that everyone can enjoy. Okay, we're doing all genres, and today we're doing a fantasy. It is a vampire fantasy, Crimson Fall by M.A. Glaude. And I don't know whether the author is female or male, but I'm going to assume female, so just be aware. I believe this is self-published. I found it on Amazon, or my husband found it for me, actually. And it bills itself as you can kind of see there, a vampire romantic thriller. I would say this is poor marketing. It is not a romance book. It's not really a thriller either. I'll get more on that in my review. What I would consider this is a vampire drama. It is a character-driven for the most part, way more so than plot-driven. There is a plot, but this is really like the author decided to have the question of if there was a new vampire, and how would they struggle with the conflict between what they would consider a monstrous nature, a monstrous new nature, and their old human nature. How would they balance that out? How would they look at the actions that they have to do now to survive and say, how does that make me falling farther away from my humanity? What actions can I still take that remind me of my humanity? That's really what the author is focused on. The author is thinking like, how does this new vampire survive her new nature? So that's really what the plot is mostly about. 2/3 of the book is really focused on that. Our female vampire, which is unusual in these kind of books, it is a female that is a vampire, and how this transformation has changed her life and how she struggles with that. And then about 1/3 of the story is a plot, which is the conflict between hunters of vampires and the vampire society, and what is driving this increase in violence. What is behind it all? Is there a conspiracy? Is there somebody pulling the strings? Kind of what's up with that, and how do we stop it? So that's kind of, it's almost the plot is there in the background, and it's there at the very end of the book, the climactic scenes of the book, but the majority of the book, up until the last, 60 pages or 100 pages or something like that, is really all about the character and her life and contrasting it with some other people. So it's kind of this balance between drama and very little bit of political maneuvering, mystery, maybe a little bit of suspense, a tiny amount of thriller. It's not a romantic thriller. Okay, the things that I like about this book. It is unique, I think, with the vampire situation. So again, we have our female vampire. It's almost always in books like this a male vampire, especially in a romance book. It's usually the male that's the vampire. So that felt a little unusual. It also is kind of a feel like, because right at the beginning, this new vampire is basically being embraced by other vampires, like, we are your family now, and it feels a little bit like the mob, like, we are your family now, focus on us, or maybe a cult or something like that, where it's, be part of us, protect us as one of us, that kind of thing. We are it. And I kind of liked that in this. It is a little bit more collective in that idea. I did like that, so the author picks a hunter, a female hunter, and contrasts it with our female vampire. So they're basically having very parallel journeys through about, again, 2/3 of the book. This is the character-driven part, where we have our vampire who has had a traumatic event and becomes a monster struggling to regain her humanity. And then you have a hunter who had a traumatic experience who is human becoming a monster. And they've got very contrasting stories there. I think the author did a great job with those paralleling of those stories. What is interesting, though, about that is the author spends a lot more time, honestly, on this female hunter and what happens with her story. It does wrap up in about 2/3 of the story. A lot more with her than she really does with the love interest. I'll get back to the love interest later. But I did like the way the author handled this female hunter and those parallels. That's really good. The character-driven story, it is interesting. Her internal struggles, her thoughts about this, like some action she has to take and how that makes her feel guilty, or perhaps there's a lack of guilt there and she thinks about that and muses on it, and there's a lot of internal struggle going on with a lot of what it is. There is some romantic scenes, some intimate scenes in this, and this is not a closed door. So there's 2 scenes in this, but it's not closed door, but it's not very... It does have some explicit language, but the author is like more poetic than anything. And I'm going to read one sentence on page 264 as an example of this. Soon their bodies melded together like 2 halves of a single flower blooming in unison, petals unfurling and entwining with each touch. Okay, that is a poetic, intimate scene, much more so than anything meant to give you a lot of visuals, let's put it that way. So it's a relatively tame open door bedroom scene, let's put it that way. And I like that, especially considering this is not a book, despite what it's billed as, it is not a romance. Okay, but it does have some romantic scenes in it. Another interesting thing is Rosalind, our main character, has a unique, magical ability, which is she can see the future, but it's not like she gets a scene and can see the whole scene. It's not like she gets one actionable piece of information. Usually it's like a kaleidoscope of broken glass is basically how she says. Little fragments that are meaningless all jumbled up. And so she can see maybe a glimpse that there's violence coming kind of idea, that something bad is going to happen, but not enough to really do something about it, at least until the very end of the book. And I did like that as a unique idea for her to have some supernatural power, because it looks like occasionally vampires do get some sort of supernatural bonus thing. So that's kind of neat. I did like that. Okay, there are some things that I dislike. One is the author does not do action scenes. And it appears that the author, you can tell she knows she can't do action scenes because she skips it altogether. Like, there are several times in this where it seems like there should be this big climactic action scene. So early on in the book, there is a big get-together between vampires, and hunters crash the party, and it should be this big, chaotic, action-filled mess. But the author does the entire scene, including what our main character Rosalind is doing, in a single page. Because she's like, we are skipping all the details, we're just going to get the big, overall big events. And then later on, towards the end, we have one character is suddenly cornered in a shop by a bunch of thugs, and the entire action takes place in 4 sentences, like this big. And then again, later on, a page later, there's another with those same thugs and several vampires, clashing, and it takes 2 paragraphs to describe the action. Yeah, this is not an action scene. There is nothing, no. The author avoids that with extreme prejudice. So, yes, it feels like there should have been more, but there wasn't. It's not poorly written, though. It is well written, but the author, and it gets the big things that you need to know that happened during these action scenes, but the action scenes themselves are really skipped. So the struggle with our main character in losing her humanity, the author decides, which I thought was a really interesting choice, is her sensation of emotion, really, that she feels like it is the way the author depicts her loss or gain of humanity. So like when our vampire is at the lowest point, she feels no action, no emotion, not even like hunger or curiosity or relief or anything. She's just like numb, like she's in shock. And the character equates that with she has lost her humanity, she's lost her soul, that kind of thing. And I think that's an interesting choice, but not necessarily a great choice. Where the idea of you are human because you feel things is a little bit of a weird way of looking at it. Like, if she didn't feel things, she's a monster, but if she feels things, she's human. I don't know. I don't think the author, when she was writing this, explicitly thought of it that way, but that's how it comes across in this book. Because every time it comes across where Rosalind is thinking about whether she is human or not human, she's thinking about the emotion that she's having about something. And so that's kind of weird. I didn't necessarily like that. So let's get now to the romance part of our romantic thriller. I would say the interactions with these, the main female character, Rosalind, and the main male character, I think his name is Michael, is maybe 10% of the whole book. It's hardly there. And their interactions are really brief, very superficial, then they fall into bed about midway through the book, and it feels like a hookup, there's like no romantic feelings. They have had nothing to emotionally connect them, either with each other or with the audience. So you're kind of like, meh, okay. They have a little hookup there, whatever. And then immediately afterwards, the guy is like, I love you. And I'm just like, there was no build up to that, okay. And then they have basically what I would consider a romantic date after that. And finally, you're starting to feel some of that connection, some of that chemistry that's been missing throughout the entire book. But this is over halfway through the book before they finally have what I would consider a good date, where they talk to each other, maybe, get to know each other, after they've, over halfway through the book. And then that's pretty much it. After that, they are together. They do have a fairly good, 2/3 of the way through the book, a good interaction where you can actually see them connecting and they have an emotional moment and all that kind of thing that you kind of see, okay, yeah, they could get together. And then the author, he's just like her sidekick the rest of the book. He's there to help with the plot because the last part of the book has the plot finally. And again, he's not there very often, but when he is there, it's not anything romantic. It's just he's there to help with further the plot. So I did not feel this was a romance at all. The romantic subplot is a very minor part of this book. As far as the thriller part, again, I think the author was like, I have this this vampire drama, and nobody wants to read a vampire drama, a general fiction about vampires, so I need to put on it, to market it, romantic thriller, because that's what people will buy, despite the fact that it's a complete lie. So the thriller part, it's really not. So there's no adrenaline until maybe the last 40 pages of the book. And, it's a significant sized book. So the last 40 pages, you finally have that big showdown of the good guys and the bad guys, sort of. And, vampires versus hunters. Again, the action is totally glossed over, but you do have this big confrontation. And that's about it for a thriller. As far as any kind of adrenaline or any kind of, quick-paced action type of scene, that's it. So this is not what I would consider a thriller. There is some political maneuvering. Again, there's some mystery, shadowy, what is going on behind the scenes, but that doesn't come across as a thriller or a suspense novel. There are hints of both, but it's not really either. Okay, I feel like our setting is underutilized. This is another thing I didn't like. So the setting is in Prohibition Chicago, and we do have a lot of scenes take place in a speakeasy, but it's not, that's pretty much the end of the setting as far as that goes. It could have been generically the 1950s or something as far as, or even the 1980s. It really, except for the fact that it's before like cell phones and computers, it really doesn't feel like the setting really matters. So I felt like that was kind of, because I was thinking, ooh, it was taking place in the Prohibition era. That would be really interesting, with speakeasies and stuff. But except for the fact that a bunch of scenes take place in something that's called a speakeasy, and they do dances there, and there's music, and maybe you could get some alcohol, except a vampire wouldn't care, it really doesn't have anything to do with that. And so, yeah, that was kind of underutilized. Finally, this is a complex vampire society with lots of, it seems like it should have lots of political maneuverings and backstabbings and stuff, but you really don't see this. You get, again, the plot really doesn't kick in until 2/3 of the way through the book, and up until that point, the vampire society is this hazy, out there, you know something's going on, but your main character isn't involved. She's kind of pushed aside, tucked away, sheltered even from the goings-on until everything collapses at this big final scene. And so I felt like there's stuff there, but the author kind of ignores it, doesn't get into it. This is a standalone novel. It does have an epilogue that hints at book 2, but you don't have to, I mean, if you didn't read book 2, this would feel like a very satisfying ending. Because it is self-published, I will say I was really impressed with the self-published aspect of this, because it doesn't have typos, it didn't have what I would consider major editing issues, where I'm like, oh, that really needs to be updated or checked or fixed or anything like that. It was well done in that respect. In fact, I would consider the writing in this pretty darn good for what it is. The pacing is relatively slow because it is character-driven for the most part, but it's appropriate for what the author was trying to do. So, if you want a vampire drama, a general fiction vampire trying to discover her place in the world with a little bit of romance and a little bit of plot and a very tiny amount of thriller, then this might be a book for you. My overall feeling, like if I was going to give it stars out of 5, I'd probably give it 4 out of 5 stars. There were, definitely some things that I didn't love about it, but they're not huge. It just feels like the book was misrepresented in marketing for what it actually is. But for what it is, I liked it. I enjoyed it. I got through the whole thing. I thought this was an interesting book, an interesting take on a genre, especially with vampires that tend to be very, one-sided. It wasn't dark. It wasn't gory. It wasn't too focused on the romantic relationships to the point of absurdity. It wasn't too silly. It had a good balance. So because of that, I'm going to give it 2 stars and recommend it. 2 thumbs up. And yeah, so if you want something different, want to support a self-published author, I would recommend Crimson Fall. Thank you for watching. I hope you join me next week.